Good morning, Sabbath School members. We have begun a new quarter, and the title of the quarter is going to be Rest in Christ. The first lesson is entitled Living in a 24/7 Society. The lesson title gives you the impression that our society is maxed out for how many days a week? 7 days a week, and for how many hours? Does it feel like that to you? So, was there ever a time in history when that was not true? What time of history would you say it was true that people were not maxed out 24/7? Okay, during the French Revolution, they didn't have the 24/7 cycle, they had a 10-week cycle, yes. A 10-day cycle, yes. The word rest is very, very positive for most of us. It invites the tired, the weary, the laborer, the exhausted to find relief. But the word rest has other shades of meaning besides physical rest. Can you think of other shades of meaning to rest other than, I'm just after working so long and hard, need a break? Can you think of other types of circumstances that would use the word rest connected to it? Can you think of any other circumstance that would involve the word rest? Okay, and respite means? Giving someone else a break, all right. I listed 5. Rest from a completed job. You've completed something, and is there usually then a little downtime right after that? We said, you completed a job, and then there's a rest. What about the end of a conflict? That feels good. What do we often say at the end of life's journey? They've gone to their, instead of death, we often say rest. What about the Sabbath celebration after a work week? It's a day of rest. And it defines our relationship with Jesus. We're at rest with him, and we'll unpack that in a little bit. Now, true or false? When it comes to living today, compared to past times, true or false, would it be accurate to say that we are softies compared to those who lived in the past? We are softies.
True.
You think it's true. Why do you think it's true?
Well, we sit down on the computers and all that kind of stuff. Back then, you had to use your hands, your back and all that stuff. You had to use your brain back then. Now there's all computers.
Compared to what it used to be? And what did it used to be?
It used to be bronze. You used to use your own health and strength to do it.
Okay. Anyone else? True or false? Would you consider ourselves softies today compared to what it was like in the past? Not sure.
So much is automated today.
Okay, today we have a lot of automation. Well, just to remind you what it was like in the past, we have a short video to tell you what it was in Newfoundland several years ago, and then watch the video because we're going to ask some questions after it's over.
Newfoundland and Labrador was changing at the start of the 1800s. Its cod fishery was thriving, and its population was increasing rapidly. All of this was linked to developments in Europe. From 1790 until 1815, Great Britain was almost continuously at war with France. The battling nations withdrew from the codfish trade. Newfoundland was left with an almost complete monopoly over the lucrative industry. Its suddenly booming economy attracted thousands of settlers. They put down roots and they started families. In a short period of time, the island's permanent population more than tripled, jumping from about 11,000 in 1792 to 40,000 in 1815. But who were these early settlers, and what was life like for them? Most came from England or Ireland, places where overpopulation and unemployment were serious problems. They were usually young, in their late teens or early 20s, and they were often poor. They came in search of work and land. Most settled along the coast and began to fish. The largest settlements were in Conception Bay, and St. John's began to emerge as the colony's commercial and government center. But the bulk of the population lived in much smaller, rural communities. They were scattered all along Newfoundland's extensive coastline. Some only had 1 or 2 families. Others had dozens. Unfortunately, few settlers knew how to read or write, so they didn't leave behind any first-hand accounts of their lives. Instead, much of our knowledge comes from outsiders, from the journals of visiting missionaries, scientists, and explorers. People whose work brought them to outport communities for brief visits. One such man was the geologist Joseph Jukes.
The first thing that strikes a stranger on entering a harbour in Newfoundland is the abundance of what are called fish flakes and stages, together with the wooden wharves and the great dark red storehouses. Now, if the reader will picture to himself, in addition to all this, a few brigs and schooners at anchor in the harbour, and a multitude of small fishing boats, 1 or 2 large-sized wooden houses painted white belonging to the merchants, and a number of unpainted wooden cottages scattered here and there at all possible angles with each other, perched upon rocks and hidden in nooks belonging to the fishermen. If, I say, he can associate all these things in his fancy, he will have before him a tolerably correct notion of a Newfoundland settlement.
But not everyone who lived in these villages by the sea would have stayed there all year. To survive, many families had to move with the seasons. They kept one house near the coast for the fishing season and another in the woods for the winter. This allowed them to harvest different resources as they became available. Of course, just what these early settlers did and when they did it varied a little from one region to another. Salmon was an important resource on Newfoundland's west coast and seals to the northeast. All we can provide is a general picture of how a seasonal round might have unfolded for early settlers. By May, people were living in their summer homes by the sea. The settlements were isolated. Judges and clergy made annual visits, but residents largely governed themselves. Traders occasionally arrived with butter, tea, clothes, and other goods, and people could visit merchant stores, but this could mean a day's journey or longer if the merchant lived in another settlement. Outport families were remarkably self-sufficient. They usually kept vegetable gardens. Cabbages were popular, and so were root vegetables. Poultry and livestock were also kept. Hens, ducks, geese, cows, sheep, goats, pigs. They were all present, but such a variety for a single family would have been rare. Families were large. 6 or more children were not uncommon, and sometimes a few generations lived under a single roof. Work dominated the daily routine. In the summer, people had to catch fish, repair nets, build boats, tend the garden, care for livestock, gather berries, spin wool into yarn, knit clothes, and perform a multitude of other chores. All family members helped out. Most places didn't have schools, so children stayed home to help with the chores. The missionary John Lewis described how a typical day began for a woman living in Burgeo in 1818.
At 4:30, Mrs. Face got up, cleaned the house, got breakfast ready, and everything very comfortable, although at the great age of 106 years old. After breakfast, she washed the tea things, put them away, and commenced sewing.
The cod fishery was a true family affair. The father and adult sons caught the fish from small open boats, and the women and children processed it. They removed the cod's head and spine, covered the fish with salt, and later spread it out on flakes to dry in the sun and the air. When the salt cod was ready, families traded it to merchants for credit in their stores. This was done in the fall, before families left their summer homes to move inland. Between October and December, many coastal residents moved to their winter houses. Some had to travel 30 miles or more. Others went a much shorter distance. They took their furniture, boats, and other belongings. Winter homes were also called tilts. They were vertical log huts, and they were usually built on a clearing in the woods. An ideal location provided shelter from stormy weather, a good supply of wood, and a nearby source of drinking water, like a pond or a river. Inside every tilt was a large fireplace. This was the focal point of family life. It kept people warm and it kept them fed. Some families smoked salmon and other fish in the chimney. The heat also meant that chickens could live inside some huts all winter long and provide a valuable source of fresh eggs. Daily life was still busy, but other activities replaced the summer routine. Chopping down trees and hauling wood was an ongoing task. Men hunted caribou and wild fowl, or trapped smaller animals for furs. Women made and mended clothes. They kept the household tidy, they raised and educated children, and prepared meals. In the spring, families returned to their coastal communities. Another seasonal round had begun. Although winter housing was common, it was not universal. Some people stayed in their coastal communities all year. Merchants and their servants rarely moved. The same is true of the better-off fishing families. If a community had another industry that supplemented the cod fishery, like shipbuilding or lobster packing or sealing, then it might not lose as many people during the winter. Winter housing also decreased as more and more social services became available. By the end of the 19th century, schools, churches, and medical facilities anchored most families to their summer homes for the entire year.
What was time primarily used for in the olden days? What was time primarily used for in the olden days? What would you say? Work. Would you say the word survival probably would be an appropriate word? They primarily put whatever they had to in order to survive. What was the major grocery store in the Newfoundland community in the olden days? What was the primary grocery store? No? Grocery store. The ocean. Oh, okay. And the forest. And did they have a few things around them? They talked about even in the winter homes, what did they have in the winter homes? They kept the chickens so they had fresh eggs. Yeah, so the grocery store was around them or in the ocean. How much extra funds did the families have to buy their desired items? None. Where was their money stored?
In the ocean.
Yeah, well, actually, but that would be potential money. But if they had any credit of any kind, where was it? Yeah, but the merchants had it. Codfish, they give to the merchants, and they'd have credit. And that's a long story. The tension between the workers and the merchants, who always seemed to win out. Although it did say that some merchants were very compassionate, and some of them, especially for families where the husbands would out to sea and never came home and left the wife, because they drowned, left the wife with large families, and some of the merchants were very compassionate to help survival. How good were the medical services in the fishing communities in the olden days? It would be whatever home remedies they could come up with. Did the wives have any health concerns over having children? What would be some of their concerns? Yeah. Yes. What do they call those ladies today usually if they're involved instead of medical doctors? Midwives, yeah, yeah. But did a lot of the ladies in the olden days pass away because of breaches and other types of complications? They did. Midwives certainly were there, but a lot of women died. And one of the big concerns that they had, and way back, even some of us can remember families, the challenge of pregnancies. If you have 12 children, you probably don't want any more. And so it kept the people in poverty. If you compare today's era with that era, which era do you think families were the closest in, and why?
Back in that era.
You think the olden days families are closer?
Oh, definitely.
Why were they closer?
Well, they all work together, and they're all helping out with chores and all that kind of stuff. Today, you barely can get a child to pick up their own clothes off the floor and put it in a hamper or something. You know what I mean? They got it so glued to the TV or to the videos, it's unrealistic to me.
So you think that the old days, the survival mode, everyone had to be in there, and so they tend to be closer together. And today, where they don't have that same concern, a lot of the family is working independently. Everyone agree? That's probably so, yeah.
It's like they had a common goal that they were all working together to achieve.
At a common goal, yes. What did families do with their extra time?
Fun work.
They did what?
Fun work.
They had fun work.
You mean back then?
Yeah. It would be visiting families and probably had very little extra time. Or if they had extra time, they would do work while they did the extra time. So I listed 7 areas that contributes to us having freer time than they had back in those days. One around grocery stores. Instead of grocery stores in that day, they had to cook from scratch. We have wash machines. Anyone here ever have to do hand washing in those scrub boards? Yeah. Okay. We have water and sewage services, usually in our homes, supplied by towns. What did they have in those days? They had good old buckets to draw the water out of the well, and outhouses. Today we have refrigerators. What did they have?
Root cellars? Root cellars?
Root cellars, yeah. And you ever heard of ice boxes?
They also would share. They would, instead of having fridges or anything, one person would kill an animal and go around the community and share it. That way they didn't need fridges.
Yes, that's an interesting concept. They would share, like they would kill an ox, and then they would share it to the whole communities. And the next week, maybe another person would kill an ox, and they'd share it with the whole community. Yes, there's a lot of sharing that way. So tell me, which era would you prefer to be living in, the good old days or the present? Where would you like to live, Thomas? Okay, because at that time it was survival mode, and that's a tough era to live in, and today it's more the intellectual developed, and so there's more advantages today. Anyone think they'd really enjoy living in the good old days? What were the benefits of living in the good old days, Jerry?
Well, everything was more wholesome.
You work just as hard today as you think they did then. Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, it's interesting because, as some people have mentioned, we're all glued to our cell phones or TVs or whatever, so nobody's interacting with each other. That's one thing. So you think, well, in the good old days you had more family and stuff. But what happens if you didn't agree with the leader of your family? You would get kicked out, wouldn't you?
I think that sounds possible.
And it sounds like you probably have to leave town.
May have to leave town. If you're, in the good old days, you lived in a family unit, and the head of that family, you crossed with them, where do you go?
That's right.
Yeah.
But you can consider back then too, chastisement was almost a blessing. If you were kind of rude in your family, you weren't very good doing your little chores and so on, well, your dad spoke to you, and next time, you get a few little smacks on the rear end, and you listen next time, and that was the way it should be.
Okay,
To me,
discipline
that's
was
the
a
way-
little.
yeah, a little thing on the backside like that wakes you up, brings you back to reality. Hey pal, you're not always.
Did
you're
you
not
ever
always
have that
wasted.
experience, Ed?
Well, I had a few encounters with my dad, but he was a good dad, you know. He made on that, and he hugged me out one time, son.
Yeah, I can remember you don't have to go back very many generations, and there are a few here that are over 50. I can remember when my mama said, we saw an orange only at Christmas time. That was a specialty at Christmas time, you'd get one orange. That would be a gift at that time. My dad, they remember in Nova Scotia, they used to have what they call a poll tax. Every able-bodied man in the winter was expected to go down and help shovel the roads. There was no big machinery. They'd shovel the roads, and if they shoveled the roads, then that would assure them a job in the summer working on the roads. That was one of the things. I have a book that's called The Good Old Days Were Terrible. And it talked about, well, one simple illustration was it talked about New York City. Can you imagine what New York City was like with thousands of horses doing both ends and ladies walking over those dirt roads with long dresses that dragged on the road? What it was like for children working 12-hour shifts, 12 hours a day. Some of the diseases that went through. Well, we had the experience with COVID. Can you imagine what it would be like if there was no possible vaccines and you had to allow it to run its course? All right, so that's our introduction. We think that we're living in a tough time. So true or false? Are we softies? Are we softies compared to
The younger generation.
the old-timers a few decades ago?
The younger generations, I think, are soft.
You think our generation isn't? Those people living.
I can speak for myself. I think I was born pretty good back then.
Yeah.
And, but not that I'm any special, but I think today there are too many softies.
So let me ask you, when the title of the lesson is maxed out 24/7, living in a 24/7 society, if you talk to many people, they would say they're maxed out, and I think many are. But the question then would be, is the max out because of a survival mode or because of a choice mode? And it would seem to me that survival, there are components of survival. Some people, especially immigrant families, possibly have to have 2 jobs or more just to keep things together, pay the rent or the mortgage and that. But for most people in North America, the survival mode doesn't seem to be as dominant as the want mode. Is that true? I need this, I want this.
Even homeless people have got it hard. But was that
Even homeless people have a car. I never heard that one before. Is that right?
homeless people?
Yeah.
You see that guys all the time on television?
Okay. Yeah.
And they got it hard. Was that because of their choice in life, along life's journey?
Yeah. So it does seem like our stress comes primarily from our desire for things and what we want, where the stress in olden days came primarily from the pressure of survival. Yeah.
Not necessarily true, because I'm a different generation from some of the folks in here. You guys grew up in a time where you could go down, get a job, work there for the rest of your life, and you'd be able to afford a car and a home and have a family, do all those types of
that's an interesting insight that was just given by Pastor Fred, in that in days past, families could tend to go down to the industry, whatever, and get a job, and they had that job for life. They'd have a level of security, and they'd be able to find their necessities. Today, the educational level is such that tens of thousands of dollars are invested to get an education, and you may or may not find the job, and then you have the added stress of meeting that. And that component is true. Even though my dad, I can remember, he said, I made $1 a day.
Yeah, the inflation rate is disproportionate. Your dollar back then, 50 years ago, is like way more than our dollar today.
Yeah.
And
Even though, okay, the value of the dollar was better then that's true.
and today, you know, I had to work 3 jobs to make $2,700.
But you also have to look at the prices of things back then.
Yeah.
They weren't the prices they are today.
Correct.
That's one, is there a balance there when you think about the wages people get today and the price of everything today? But back then, okay, it was, everything was, if you had a quarter back then, come on, you could get a pop, a bag of chips and a bar for a quarter.
Yes.
But you can't even get it in chips.
Okay, in the olden days, you'd get chips, a bar, and what was the third one? A bar for 25 cents. The way to compare it, I think, is, well, in my own generation, when I started pastoring, I think I got a little around $600 a month. But then I could buy a new car every year for a month's salary. I could upgrade every year for one salary. Can I do that today? Would I be able to upgrade a new car for a month's salary, that much depreciation over a year? I tend to think, but that's only a subjective, that we probably have a little more spending money today than the old timers. There's a little more cash flow there, but I could be wrong. That may just be my perspective on it. The basic conclusion, as we think about this topic, is that in olden times, rest was connected with labor for survival. Today, rest is there because of our choices, usually, on how we will relate to the things we desire and the lifestyle we live. It has more of a freedom choice now as it relates to rest than it did back in those times. Okay, let's move on.
But excuse me, back in those times, if you work with your dad or your family,
Yeah.
well, you're doing okay.
Back in those times, yeah, you worked with your family, dad or granddad, and you would learn a trade.
Yes, you were. You learn the trades, and you're also being fed, looked after, and housed and everything. You know, that's money right there, if you look at it.
It's worth something, yeah, to be cared for in the family unit,
As long as you did your work.
as long as you did your work. Okay.
If you're lazy about things, well, you will know very quickly. You know what I mean?
You weren't appreciated if you were
wanna be in the
lazy.
family or you be out of the family.
All right, let's go into Sunday's lesson. Sunday's talking about worn and weary, and it opens up with a very interesting question. Why would God create a rest day before anyone was even tired? Why would God create a rest day before anyone was even tired? God is all-knowing, so He's giving you an example of something before you get there. All right, interesting. Why would He create a rest day before you're even tired?
I share the same opinion that God is God, and He knew before time what was going to happen, and as such, you need this.
So God knew ahead of time. Could there be any other reason? Remember, we opened our topic by saying there are several kinds of rest. So can you think of another kind of rest that could be connected with the Sabbath? Is the Sabbath rest different than the kind of rest that you have after working a 12-hour shift? What's the difference? I see his.
Adam and Eve weren't working because they
Yeah, okay. But think of this perspective. If you complete a good job and you've worked hard at it and it's well done, is there a joy that comes to you to reflect, step back, take a little time to look upon the job that you just completed? That is a term rest is connected to. Rest is a time to reflect. It's a time to look at what you have just done. So if you think about the Sabbath rest, which was the first day for Adam and Eve, it was a time for all creation to step back and to worship God, give glory to Him for the beautiful things He just did, just completed. And they could enter into the joy of that restful moment. It's a little difficult. Well, coming back a couple of Sabbaths ago, we saw a moose on the side of the road. You don't see that very often anymore. So what did we have to do? We stopped, got the camera out and took some pictures. How much easier to stop and look and take pictures than to keep driving and try to take pictures, keep moving and involved. No, you tend to stop when you want to take a moment to appreciate. So that is part of the concept of rest. That is reflection, a restfulness of appreciation. What does rest time give you an opportunity to do? I just mentioned it's a time for reflection. Can you think of any other benefits that comes out of the idea of rest besides reflection? I've listed 6 of them. If you take a rest, what types of benefits, what does it give you an opportunity to do? Rejuvenation, okay, yeah. Recharging the battery, good. Rest does that. Would it be good to work 24/7, 7 days, 14 days, 21 days, 28 days without a break? Is there a benefit to break? What's the benefit of breaking?
Your mentality.
Okay, you're right. Your mindset. You need a break. You can't do it continuous. What happens if you don't get a break? What happens to you personally? You break down. That's right. And what about productivity? It breaks down. So in the olden days, you worked like 12 hours, straight, even young people. But they have found it's good to have a morning break and an afternoon break. Your productivity actually stays up if you have appropriate breaks. Some other things I've listed. It provides a time of anticipation. If you know you have a break ahead, you have anticipation towards that, whether it's towards fellowship or worship, coming together like we do. Gives you a break from continuous labor, reflection time. It also provides transition thinking, going from this to that. All right, that's a little bit on the worn and the weary for Monday. Running on empty. When you hear the phrase running on empty, what does that mean for you? If someone says, I'm running on empty, what does that mean to you? That's a phrase.
Almost collapsing, almost done.
You're almost up?
Yes.
What does running on empty? I'm running on empty. What does that mean to you?
Can't go any further.
You've had it. You can't go any further. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah, for a car, if it's running on empty, how far are you going to go? On the fumes. Okay. Any other thoughts? What does running on empty mean to you? What about your brain power? What do you connect with? If I said, I'm running on empty, what's another word I can use if I refer that to my brain? I sometimes even say it. I'd say, my brain is dead. Do you know, anyone know what that means? Some of you students probably know. If my brain is dead, if I say that, what am I saying?
I'm exhausted and
Absolutely right. My brain is fried. I can't study another page. I don't want to think of another idea. I got to close this book. I'm brain dead. I'm exhausted. I'm weary. I'm brain dead. I have no strength. Anxious as there seems to be no solution. So running on empty usually is an extreme expression. In our lesson, we talked with Jeremiah 45, and Judah has just been conquered. Jerusalem has just been conquered by Nebuchadnezzar. And Jeremiah has a secretary. His name is Baruch. And God gives a message to Baruch. And it's very interesting. And he says, Jeremiah 45:5, do not seek great things for yourself. Now that sounds strange for God to say that to Baruch. But do you know why God said that to Baruch? Do not think right now of attaining great things. Why? Because I'm going to bring even more devastation. And I want you to know, however, I'm going to preserve your life so you don't die. So for Baruch, the gift of God was not, I'm going to bless you with many great things. The blessing to Baruch was, hey, it's going to be tough, it's going to be difficult, but I want you to know I'm going to preserve your life. And that's interesting. Wouldn't you say that that would be a priority for you too? If you had the opportunity to choose, I can see that you get many things, or I can preserve your life going through this difficult COVID time or whatever. Which would you prefer? Well, I want to live, so I would prefer life. And so that was the message that went to Baruch. So the question comes, are there really basic things that we desire? Are there things that we really would prefer? And we would say, yes, family, I want hope, I want freedom from pain. Those are some of the things. Tuesday's lesson, defining rest in the Old Testament. Now, a very interesting question in the Old Testament revolves around the Ten Commandments. What does the Ten Commandments say about work and rest? What does the Ten Commandments say about work and rest?
Work 6 days, rest on the 7th.
Work 6 days and rest on the Sabbath. So it relates to both work and rest. Now, question. I'm supposed to work 6 days and rest on the 7th. If I work 3 12-hour shifts per week, am I violating the Ten Commandments? Because I'm only working 3 days, 3 12s. If I'm working 3 12 shifts for the week, am I violating the Ten Commandments because it tells me to work 6 days?
It's as easy as I think, yes.
You think I would be?
It doesn't matter the hours, it says work 6 days.
Okay.
Though your 3 days may be equivalent to 36 hours or how many hours, it's still not the 6 days that you're asked.
Okay, so
But I don't think that you working 3 days would have stopped the other work that you have to carry out for the rest of the week.
so you may have other things to do the rest of the week. Okay, so God wouldn't be saying work 6 12-hour shifts. God wouldn't invite us to do 6 12s.
Some people don't even have a job, so.
Yeah, so how do they fulfill that commandment then, Bridget? Yes, Larry?
Christian, if you haven't even got a job, and you gotta go by this, what you're just saying there, 6 days and then the 7th rest, you got to work 6 days? I don't think so.
Well, Pastor, when I was 17 and 18, I used to drive a dump truck for my father, and I used to work 16 hours a day. And on Saturday, because I wasn't at Adventist then, I used to work 10 hours. So that was sort of a break, right? So, I mean, you
So Larry is saying he was working really 7 days a week, 11 to 16 hours, and eventually his body just closed down. Yeah. So when we talk about work 6 days, some of the comments that I'm hearing indicates the only kind of work that's acceptable is a job. What kind of work is acceptable besides a job outside the house? Go ahead, Alice, nice and loud. Go ahead.
Me?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you guys can mow the lawn outside the house, you can do your shopping, and all that kind of stuff. That's work. Laundry, that's work.
So we need to broaden the understanding of the word work, don't we?
Pastor, all those hours that fellow got to work, and then like, like Al was saying, you get your break, but then sometimes I'd have to take the big springs off the truck, take the whole thing off, take the center bolt, take the 6 wheels off the truck, and sometimes break them down by hammering them off, because you didn't have the technology back in those days to do it. And then you had to blow it up by hand to get to a service station.
Yes.
So that was your break day.
Yes. And one interesting thing, often we don't realize, unless we compare with others, how much we really are working. Not until you start comparing.
And a fireman.
And that's why a lot of people had contentment in the old days, even though they worked those kind of hours, because everybody was doing it.
A fireman, for instance, works 24 hours in one shift,
Yep.
every 3 days. Then the next day, he go back to another 24-hour shift.
Yes.
So in between those shifts, people may think that they're doing nothing. But a lot of these people are out actually working, doing renovations and whatever they're doing, right?
Yes.
To make extra money.
So, yeah, there are people, and sometimes intern doctors, they'll work 24-hour shifts too, and you wonder, woo.
Yeah.
Anyway, when you go back to the 10 Commandments and rest, who was to get the benefit of the rest of the Sabbath, on the Sabbath? Who was to get the benefit of the rest on the Sabbath? Man was to give. Who else? The animals were. Anyone else? Your male and female servants. And the animals too. So it's a total restfulness that would come on that time. And we've talked the reasons of the benefits already. Now going to the story of the Old Testament, Joshua. It was told about Joshua that he was going to do rest. What kind of rest was Joshua going to find? What kind of rest was Joshua going to find for the people of Israel? What kind of rest? Joshua 11:23. What was the main story of Joshua focused on? When you go to the book of Joshua, what was the main focus of the book of Joshua?
Well, they were supposed to go in and take the land.
Yes.
Divide it all
Yes.
among the tribes.
Take the land, divide it, and then what? What would bring rest for that activity? The wars are complete. He has conquered it all. And so the land finds rest because the war is over. So it's rest from the conflict of conquering the land. And so Joshua found rest for the people. Now there's a saying that some of you probably have heard. Tell me what it means. A change is as good as a rest. What does that mean? A change is as good as a rest. A change is not a rest, is it? But it says a change is as good as a rest. What does that mean?
You get to be on an assembly line for that. And I was on an assembly line one time in Toronto where they make muff for a tailpipe for cars and truck. And you're there on the spot, and they're coming all the time. You get bang, 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 bang. But sometimes they take you off and put you on another machine, and boy, that would be a complete break because you were just gone doing the same thing over and over.
Okay, a change as good as a rest means a different perspective and activity. What gives you a sense of renewal? Is that what it is?
It gives you some hope when you're
Yeah, can it?
that monotonous
Yeah. Can anyone else think of something where that happened to them, a change as good as the rest? Ed Meyer, when you're studying, your brain is thick. Do you ever do something to change and all of a sudden you're alert again? What would be something that you would do at that time that would just revive you?
Physical exercise is very important for me. Swimming is a healing,
Can't quite hear, the mask muffles it for me.
I mean that physical exercise is very important for me.
Exercise, yeah. Exercise can bring about that change, and also then it revives you. If you're working in an office all day, and you're tied to computer and books and meetings and all that, you go home to have a couple hours of rest. Is normally reading and studying the best activity? If you're using your brain all day, probably helping with the dishes, doing some homework, housework, that type of thing. But if you're doing physical activity all day, a change for you may be doing some reading and studying. So it's a change of the use of our different faculties.
Well, mental work to me is more difficult than labor work. Because I've worked at that working for 25 years.
Oh, no, that's interesting. Some work is more exhausting than others, you're saying.
Yes, I know what it's like. I've experienced it.
Yep.
And I sit down to a drafting table all day long.
Yes.
Sometimes I fall asleep on the table.
Yes. Some jobs would have a higher energy, tension, focus level, and that's harder on you physically, mentally, all around than some other types of job. Now, I have another question. Is this true or false? God orders our stops as well as our steps. True or false? God orders our stops as well as our steps.
It was true for Paul.
It was true for Paul. How was it true for Paul?
He was on his own journey to persecute some Christians, and God stopped him. And then he ordered him to go meet somebody in the nearby town.
Okay, that's a good biblical example of Paul or Saul on his way to Damascus. God did stop as well as order his steps. So you would agree. Anyone else? Jonah, okay. Was Jonah stopped in his tracks? He was stopped in his tracks. All right, restfulness, we got 2 minutes. In the New Testament, what did Jesus say to his disciples? Come apart and do what? Rest for a while. Do you remember the rest of that story? So they got on the boat and they went off. Did he find rest, Thomas? What did he find when he took his disciples? When he got to the other side, the people had seen where the boats were going, and when he got to the place of rest, they were there. And so it says he had compassion. The only rest he had was in the journey to get there. Let's see, Hebrews 4, we'll close in Hebrews 4. Hebrews 4 is a chapter in the New Testament that talks a lot about rest. And it's interesting. Therefore, since there was a promise remained to enter his rest, let us fear lest anyone seem to come short. And it talks about Israel. They did not enter into rest because they did not mix it with faith. Oh, so they didn't mix it with faith. You're not talking about physical rest then, are you? You're talking about spiritual rest. And so it comes down to verse 6. Since therefore it remains that some must enter it, and those to whom it was first preached did not enter because of disobedience. And then it ends up in verse 9, therefore there remains a rest to the people of God. So here it talks about we need to find rest in Jesus. We need to find contentment in Jesus. And Thursday ends off with the restless wanderer, and he was the first murderer. His name was Cain. And it says, a fugitive and a vagabond you shall be because you've done this to your brother. The New International Version says, you will be a restless wanderer. Why would Cain be a restless wanderer in the earth? What would make him a restless wanderer?
He
So inside he had that realization. He had no repentance, and he did not have rest with God.
There's no rest for the wicked.
Is that a Bible text?
But it's true, because their hearts are not humbled, so they're not able to find peace for their soul.
Yeah. Now ask yourself this question. The restless wanderer, it says, goes and starts a city. He gets married and has a child. What is the possibility of that city or that family being restful? Is it possible for a restless person to have a restful environment?
Until Jesus becomes a part of that person, then there will be no rest.
So is there really an advantage to us to be restful ourselves in Jesus? The people that are around us, whether at home or in the workplace, they will pick up our attitude of restfulness, and they will then have rest. Yeah, so that's the story of Cain. So let's end with the beautiful text we all know so well, which is Matthew 11:28. Come unto me, all ye that are late and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. So God has given us the opportunity of a restful relationship with him, and to enter into a restful day of worship and fellowship. If there's anyone here that's in the environment of restfulness but is agitated in their spirit, Jesus says, come unto me, and all that come unto me, I will give you rest. Loving Father, we thank you for a new series of lessons. May we appreciate the times in which we're living. We have more choices. We don't have to live generally in survival mode for most of us. Help us to make choices of simplicity so that our lives don't become complicated, so that we do have less pressures that don't need to be there, so that we can have time to enter into a quality restfulness with you, and enter into relationships to help others that may be struggling in their times of restlessness. Thank you for the privilege of providing the Sabbath, where we can find rest in you and fellowship with each other. For the privilege of doing that, we thank you. In Jesus' name, amen.